I know that for a lot of you, you have done grant writing before, but some of you in your organizations are new to it or will be starting it soon. So we thought that this would be a good opportunity to provide some very basic information about grant writing that can be used not only for IDA activities, but also could be used for some of your other um, fund-seeking opportunities. So hopefully you will find this helpful. As Vivian said at the beginning, that this webinar will also be available on our website, and you'll have the opportunity to access it at your convenience. We hope that in 2018 that there will be an FPP5 and hopefully another round of FPPG. And if that is the case, we want to make sure that organizations are prepared and can turn in a very strong application so that they can receive those funds, which help for these organizations to do the very important work that they do in their communities across Illinois. So let's get started. Everybody knows about our mission and our values and who we are and how we do it. So our agenda is to start with understanding grants, um, developing your ideas for funding, identifying potential funders, what you should do before you start writing, how to write a letter of inquiry, how to write a standard proposal, tips for grant submission, and what to do if you don't receive funding, and a little bit of practice. So again, as I said in the beginning, that some of this information for some of you that have been working on grants for some time, um, you will be familiar with this, but we believe that there are probably people on this call or people that are going to reference this webinar going forward that don't have the same information. So we are starting at the very beginning and providing as much information as possible. So what is it? A grant are is in its simplest form is money that is given to your organization that doesn't have to be paid back. It can come from government. It can come from a private foundation. Um, um, but it is a process in order to secure a grant. It takes some planning, development, coordination with your staff, with your partners, and stakeholders, and they all take time. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be writing a grant, that you are giving yourself plenty of time to not only do the research that you'll need for this grant, but also for putting the grant application and its supporting documentation together. There is a timeline for grants. It involves developing an idea, identifying a funder, contacting a funder, writing a letter of inquiry if that is required, um, submitting a proposal if you are invited to submit a proposal, uh, receiving an award, and implementing the program. Or if you are not invited to apply, where are you going to secure funding? Or if you're not awarded a grant, where will you apply next? For a lot of organizations, the thought of what we're going to do or how we're going to do it sometimes does not come until after the grant application has been released. So say, for example, that IDA releases FPP5 next year, then an organization might start thinking about, oh, what would we like to do with FPP5? Let's figure that out. We'd like to suggest that our organizations start thinking about uh, what short and long-term things you want to do regardless of a grant, and start working from that perspective. So say, for example, that your housing organization is interested in offering a new program. You want to expand the offerings so that you maybe are providing a new program that's aimed at renters in your community. You can, regardless of whether there's a grant application out or not, can start to think about how would we like this program to function? Who do we need to run it? How much is it going to cost? When would we want to launch it? And what kind of impacts and outcomes do we expect will come from this? Then, once you have a clear understanding of what your goals and your objectives are, when funding opportunities come available, you will be ready because you've already started thinking about this process. So basically, we are suggesting that you not be reactive, but that you be proactive and already start having ideas on what it is that you want to do long before a grant application comes out, because then you can um, have that idea in place and be ready when the grant application comes out to actually apply for that program. So, get an understanding of how reasonable or feasible your potential project and program is. Speak with your partners, advisors, and other organizations that have done this in order to get a better understanding, and research the best practices. So again, if you are, let's say, looking at to use this rental example, if you are going to be doing this type of rental program, how reasonable or feasible is the program that you're putting together? Are the costs reasonable? Will you have good outcomes and impacts from what you're doing? Are there other organizations that are out there near you that are doing the same thing? Why is yours distinctive? And also, if there are other organizations that are doing this in another part of the state, do you have the ability to check in with them on what they did and what they learned to help better frame and better focus the program that you're putting together? So, what kind of questions should you be asking yourself? Um, what materials, what equipment, what people, what training, what partners do you need to make this happen? Do you need to develop your own curriculum if you are doing a rental program? Is there a rental curriculum out there that you can use? How much training will your staff need in order to do this? Will this require doing group classes, or will this require one-on-one counseling? How much time is that going to take? Um, what are some of the challenges? What happens if you don't see as many people coming initially as you think? Also, why is this project needed? Um, how will you go about making this happen? Who will benefit? Um, will it be low to moderate income individuals in your community? Will it be people that never think about your housing counseling organization maybe coming to you because you are talking about something that impacts their lives on a daily basis? Um, when do you expect to see results? And be realistic about when you're expecting to see those results. If you say, well, we expect to see those results in 6 months, but it actually takes you 12 months, um, how are you going to be able to explain that to a funder if you receive an award? And where will this happen? Are you going to do this in your service area? Are you going to do this beyond your service area? How are all those things going to happen? So the more planning that you do, the more likely it is that you will be awarded funding. Now, of course, all funding is very competitive, and so it's going to depend on how well you are able to convey your ideas, but the more planning you do, the more likely it is that you will be awarded. So you want to develop an action plan that will help you stay on schedule. So, for example, what I do at Housing Action Illinois is once an application comes out, and a perfect example is the Comprehensive Housing Counseling NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability from HUD. Once that NOFA comes out and indicates what date the NOFA responses are due, I go through the entire NOFA, look at all the questions that are going to be asked that we have to answer, break those into individual pieces, and indicate on a spreadsheet each question, who is responsible for answering that question, what date it has to be answered, and then a check mark for when that was actually completed. And that way I can then go back every day and look and make sure that all the things that we need to do for the application, answering all the questions, providing the supporting documentation, making sure that there are any attachments that we need for this application are all accounted for in this spreadsheet. All the people working on it are accounted for in this spreadsheet. And that way we can track everything, make sure that it's being done on time. We can make adjustments if we need to, if things are taking a little bit longer than we expected. But by mapping all of those things out, it allows us to see very clearly what we're doing and make sure that we're going to be on time. You also want to, before you start thinking about how to conform your program to the application, you just want to actually read the application and read all the questions and make sure that you understand all of those. And then you can start thinking, once you've read all the questions, about how you want to answer those based on the program that you are looking to do. There are a number of resources for grant seekers that are available. There's grants.gov, foundationcenter.org, GrantSpace, GuideStar.org, Forefront, and the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. You also have the ability of surfing the web, which I know most of you know, talking with colleagues, working or talking with experienced grant writers, and then also going to your local library for additional information. But there are usually, between grants.gov, if you are applying for federal dollars, you can sign up with grants.gov and find out all of the different grants that are available. You can actually search grants.gov either by federal department or you can search them by topics like community development or housing, for example. What one should look for in a potential funder. Um, there are some funders that will only fund organizations in a particular area. So you might see like one of the big foundations is the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Alfred P. Sloan was the chairman of General Motors in its heyday. But he has there's a foundation in his name, and it focuses on specific areas, or it might have the foundation has uh, one program that they might do nationally, but they might have another program that is just in New York City. So you want to make sure that as you're doing your research that you are looking at that and making sure that the funder has a focus, a geographic focus in which you fit into, because it would be very unfortunate to think that you have found a very good funder and then realize late in the process that they are not funding your service area. In terms of your funding priorities, if since you have already started to develop your program and have an understanding of what it is that you want to do, you want to try and find a funder that matches what it is that you are trying to do. And the reason I say that is that if you have a program that you're trying to create and it's a very bad fit for some funding, but you're going to pursue that funding, if you are awarded that funding, you might not be able to do exactly what it is that you'd like to do because the fit never worked from the beginning. You also want to understand, what is the mission of this particular foundation? What are they trying to do? What's important to them? Um, is there a match between your priorities and their priorities? Because if you need to make too many changes to your program, then you might not be able to have the impacts and outcomes that you would like. Um, you want to make sure that you are, in terms of funding amounts, paying attention to uh, how much you can get, and when those dollars are going to be distributed. Like for example, we know that the Comprehensive Housing Counseling Program is a reimbursement grant. So that means that you need to have dollars up front in order to fund your operations until you are reimbursed by HUD. So you want to make sure that you understand that, because in that way you can design your program correctly. And also making sure that the grant amount would be sufficient for your plan. So let's say that you are working on this rental idea and you've looked at staffing and you've looked at materials and marketing and communications and all of those things, and you've decided that in order for this program to operate successfully, you need $150,000 over 2 years. Well, if an organization, a funder comes to you and says, we can't give you 150, but we can give you 75,000 over that 2 years, based on the numbers that you've put together, you already know your program's not going to work at that number, or you're going to have to do a much smaller program than what you had originally planned. So you either, in that case, need to decide, can you really do this for $75,000, or do you need to look for another funder that can come up with the rest of the dollars so that you have $150,000 to do what it is that you have set out to do? And the reason why we bring this up is we understand that there is always a need to compromise. There's always a need to potentially change your vision on how something would work. But if you compromise too much, then you might not be able to achieve what it is that you have initially set out to do, which then becomes not only disappointing for your organization, but potentially disappointing for that funder as well. So I started talking about understanding your budget needs, and it is extremely important that you are able to do that, that you know what your personnel costs are going to be, your travel, equipment, supplies, anything else that you're going to need, making sure that you understand all of those costs so that you can build those into any grant application correctly. Because if you don't know, or if there are any unforeseen costs that come up, it could impact the ability to actually complete your project. So, as much as you can, make sure you understand exactly what all of your costs are going to be. Put together a budget so that you know those costs, and if you have to make some changes, you're able to think about that prior to submitting the application as opposed to post award. So before you start writing, build a customized checklist for every grant. And I talked about what Housing Action Illinois does for the Comprehensive Housing Counseling application. Check the web page and highlight the language that they use. Something that we like to use around here sometimes, or at least I like to use, are what are called word clouds. And what word clouds allow you to do is you take a sample of language. So, for example, I do this um, with job notices. Is you take the description from the job notice and you put it in this word cloud, and it will, by looking at the number of times that the word is used, will show you which words have been emphasized, and literally it will show you the words in a bigger font, those that are used more often, and in a smaller font for those that are used less often. And then that way you have the ability of using those keywords in your application responses, because those are signals that a funder is giving you of what's important to them. Meet with your coworkers and partners to build that application schedule. So if it is going to be more than one person working on that application, then you should have a team meeting prior to um, the soon after the application comes out, so that you can determine what we need to put in this application, what attachments need to be included with the application, and who's responsible for what. Who's actually doing the writing? Who's doing the research? Who is making sure that your 501c3 certificate is being attached to the application? Who's making sure that all of these things are in the file? So having a team meeting, if you're going to have more than one person working on this, is very important. And then keeping in touch during this process is very important, because um, good communication leads to an effective application. If you're not communicating well, things get dropped, and then you're scrambling at the last minute. Check the requirements for the application, what needs to be there. There have been so many times where a person has had their application rejected because they've forgotten an attachment, or they've forgotten to sign something. So you want to make sure that all of those things are very clear, uh, and you are responding to those. Many of the applications that organizations are doing now, or that foundations are putting out, are online applications, and they have boxes for your written responses. And so it might mean that there is a limit. The um, sometimes the application will show there's a 500 character limit or a 2,500 character limit. Um, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those things as you're writing the application, so that you can craft a narrative or a response to a question that fits into those character limits, and not wait until the last minute, because if you um, answer a question and you find that your answer is far longer than the character limit, then that means that you have to go back and edit that answer. And if you wait until the last minute, then you might not be able to finish all the editing before the application is due. So pay attention to that up front, so that you are aware and you can answer those questions using those character limits, and not run into having to scramble to do your editing towards the end of the application. So there are some funding applications that require a letter of inquiry before you actually get an application, and that is um, um, sometimes they will want to hear from you what it is that you're interested in doing, learn a little bit more about your organization before they will decide to invite you to submit a full application. So if you are going to be doing a letter of inquiry, you really want to make sure that you are researching your funder's priorities, that you're writing a narrative about your project, and that you are putting that in a format that's going to be inspiring to your funder. This is your chance to tell who you are, what you're about, and what kind of impact and outcome you think you're going to have. Because this is a letter of inquiry, it should be clear, it should be concise and succinct. And this helps you to start building this relationship with your funder. So, how to write that letter of inquiry: who your organization is, what your organization does, what does your organization need, why do you need this, or even better yet, why does your community need this? I used earlier the example of the rental program. Why does your community need this? What are they going to get from that? Uh, Focus on measurable objectives, which are really the return on investment for the funder. When they're giving out money, they want to make sure that they can go back and say, "We saw, we made an impact. We saw a outcome. There has been a benefit to not only the organization, but the people that have been helped by that organization. So um, this slide shows you what you want to consider doing in your opening paragraph, your statement of need, and then what your methods are. And again, who are you and what do you want to do? Why do you want to do this? What is so important? And how are you able to make this compelling to a reader on why this is something that the foundation should consider funding? Are you going to be collaborating with someone else? Would that be and why? Um, make sure all those details are there. What are the expected outcomes? What's your credibility? If your organization has been in existence for several years, then you have hopefully received several grants before and should be able to briefly address that in your letter of inquiry. You might be asked to provide a budget, and if you are asked to do that, then you want to be able to indicate the costs in your budget, and then provide a closing paragraph where you are asking permission to submit a full application. You are providing additional or an offer to provide more information if it's requested, and then you're going to have that signed and sent off. So if you hear from your letter of inquiry, if the foundation comes back and says, we've received your letter of inquiry and we invite you to submit an application, then you're going to start working on your standard grant proposal. If this is an organization or a foundation that does not require a letter of inquiry, then you might just be doing the standard grant proposal. So we're just going to talk about that a little bit. You know, what is it you're trying to do? You are trying to demonstrate to the funder that you can help them to reach their goals. If you look at the mission statements, if you look at the vision statements from different foundations, it's very clear what they're interested in doing and why they're doing it. So you want to make sure that you can show that your program has the ability of helping them meet their goals. But again, as we talked about earlier, don't compromise your program so much that you can't meet your goals. So you want to have a program and have a funder that has a common understanding and joint objectives. Because if you have a funder who has a program that doesn't exactly meet what you're looking to do, or it requires you to compromise too much, you might not be able to actually meet the objectives and outcomes that you had originally planned, and that could mean no further funding from this particular foundation. So you will probably, as a part of your standard grant proposal, need to provide an introduction, your goal statement and objectives, needs, methods, expected outcomes, how you're going to evaluate, do you have existing and where future funding is going to come from, and a budget narrative. You want to introduce your organization in terms that are relevant to the grant opportunity, establish credibility, and show your accomplishments. So if your organization has been around for a number of years, you should be able to point to several accomplishments that your organization has had, and why you are building on those accomplishments with additional programs. Include your mission and vision statements, because hopefully everything that you are doing is in line with your mission and vision. Make sure that you include up-to-date demographic or socio-economic data to show why your organization exists. So, for example, in the most recent FPPG application, there were questions about unemployment in the area that your organization planned on serving. So you are able to get um, very recent unemployment data from the Illinois Department of Workforce Development, the Illinois Department of Workforce Development. And you want to make sure that you have that information because if you're saying with FPPG, for example, that you want to provide foreclosure counseling in your service area, one of the reasons that you might want to do this is because there's been a high unemployment rate, and as people have been losing their jobs, they have not been able to pay their mortgages and are starting to default. So you can use that information to very clearly explain why you are providing the service that you are providing. So your goal statement and objectives. You want to express the desired result of the project, and what are some of the smaller scale outcomes that are going to lead to that goal. Are what is what you're doing ambitious but achievable? So again, because you have already started thinking about this program long before you put together an application, you should be able to answer this question. You should be able to explain what we're doing is ambitious, but it's achievable because we've done our homework when we figured this out. At the end of your project, the objectives will tell you to which degree you have been successful. So you want to make sure that you're very clear on what those objectives are because that's what you're going to be measured against. So you always want to be keeping those things in mind. A really good proposal is going to have 3 to 5 strong objectives of what it is that you are looking to do. Uh, you should be describing who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, and how it will be measured. Your need statement. Make sure that it's realistic. We know you can't solve everything in one program. So you want to create something that is going to be realistic. If you are, again, with rental, you're not going to be able to solve everybody's rental issues. But if you are able to solve some of them through your program, then you have created a great benefit. You also want to use this opportunity to make sure that that you're thoroughly explaining um, what you're doing or what the problem is, so that your potential funder is confident that you understand the problem. Um, and you should, with your research and with your service to the community, be able to very clearly show that. Um, and make sure that you are showing that that an impact can be had, and that it's not something that can never be solved and is just gloom and doom. Um, we've talked about research. We've talked about making sure that you are able to explain the program and how it impacts your clients, and that the objectives are related to the need. What activities are you going to use to achieve these objectives? So, as with the rental, you're going to do one-on-one counseling to help people with their particular rental issues. You want to be able to explain um, whose day-to-day responsibilities, who's going to perform them, what the timelines are, how that's going to be facilitated, and how the clients are selected. Are clients just going to walk in? Are you going to specifically market to clients? What's going to happen? How is that going to work? And make sure that you are being as detailed as possible in that explanation to the potential funder. Um, how are you going to achieve these objectives in a cost-efficient manner? Um, if you are um, asking for $150,000 over 2 years, how are you able to justify that that is a reasonable cost? And another important thing is how are you building in measurements so that you can gauge the progress of your activity. Because you certainly don't want to get 2 years down the road and realize that all the things we said or some of the things that we said we were going to do didn't happen. You want to know that earlier so that if you need to make adjustments, you have the ability to do that. What are the expected outcomes? Oops, is this one in here twice? I'm sorry. Evaluation. Um, what is the? How are you going to evaluate the progress towards the objectives? How are you going to tie into the need statement so that the results can be used to further understand the problem? Um, you should ensure that your evaluation techniques are both valid and creative. So, what if you are doing this rental program? How are you going to evaluate it? Are you going to evaluate it by the number of people who are um, able to get an apartment after being counseled by you? Or are you going to evaluate it by the number of people who are able to keep their apartment if there were any issues with a lease or a landlord or anything like that? What are you going to use to evaluate this? Are you going to do surveys of your clients and share that as part of your evaluation? If you are receiving funding from more than one source, you also want to indicate that. And as you are looking to do a program, if you're doing this rental program, for example, um, we're sure that you're not just planning on doing it for 2 years, that you want to actually do this program for multiple years because it's important for your community. So if you're asking a funder for 2 years worth of funding, uh, where is the funding going to come from to sustain the program? How are you going to be able to convey to the funder, to the potential funder, that you have other funds available, or that you where you're going to be seeking other funds, so that as the funds from this particular funder twilights, you have other dollars that are available. Your budget. All of you know how important these budgets are. You want to be able to um, clearly explain what costs are going where, um, and um, showing what your personnel costs are, your direct costs, what your indirect costs are. Um, if you are seeking funding from more than one source, then you want to clearly show what you are asking for your funder to pay for and what you're asking other organizations to pay for. You want to make sure that it's very clear so that even if it's someone that doesn't have a lot of financial background, has the ability to read it. And if there is anything that needs to be explained, then you want to make sure that you are providing some detail in that budget with some explanation. So, for example, if you have a salary line, it might be worth your time to provide a description saying that uh, these funds will be used to support a housing counselor, a program manager, and their fringe. That way, someone understands. Oh, okay, I get exactly what they're using that money for. Tips for grant submission: um, follow the instructions, use a readable font, follow standard format and page limits, and so important, submit ahead of time, especially when you are doing an online application. Sometimes, um, when there is an online application, there might be many other people that are trying to submit at the same time, and there could be a slowdown of the website. There could be an issue with so many things happening at the same time. So, if the application is due on a Friday at 5 o'clock, you don't want to plan on submitting it Friday at 4:30. You should actually be planning on submitting it on Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning. So that way, if there are any issues, you have a few hours to get that taken care of. So, for example, with the comprehensive housing counseling application that we submit to HUD, let's say that that application is due on a Friday, our goal is always to submit it 24 hours in advance to grants.gov so that if there are any issues that we have the ability to fix it. I can tell you the first time that we applied for comprehensive housing counseling funding in 2015, we did have an issue. We had submitted our application 24 hours in advance, and there was a problem submitting with one of the other websites. Now, because we were submitting 24 hours in advance, we were able to touch base with this other particular website, get the information that we needed, fix that, and then get the application in. But if we had waited until 4:30 and the application was due at 5 o'clock, then there's no way we would have been able to get the things done that we needed to get that application in on time. So I can't emphasize enough of not waiting until the last minute to submit your application. You want to make sure that you submit it earlier. If your program is funded, congratulations. That's what you put all this hard work in, but your hard work is not done. You've got a grant agreement that you will receive from your funder. Make sure that you clearly understand it and what they're looking for and what reporting is going to be and how you can draw down the funds. If there are any questions, then you need to be in touch with your funder immediately. If there are things that you're not sure that you're going to be able to do based on what is in the contract, see if there's room to negotiate that so that you can change it, because you don't want to just accept it and then 2 years down the road you haven't met that objective. And then again, as we talked about, you'll come to an agreement and determine when and how those funds will arrive. If your funding program is not funded, make sure you thank the funder for the opportunity and seek out a meeting to review your application. Oftentimes these applications are scored, and so it's very clear to a funder on how an application did in terms of that score, and they can share some of that information with you to help you to better in your next application. It might not hurt to ask if you can resubmit your proposal with changes. They might say yes, they might say no. This one, of course, is obvious, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but you certainly don't want to disparage a potential funder because they didn't fund you. That could get out, and that could prove to be a problem in the future. Learn from that experience and adjust your proposal and seek out another funder. So, practice. We talked earlier about the letter of interest. So you should try to write a letter of interest or a letter of inquiry, using grant language. And then identify some data sources that you can use for the statement of need. I talked about unemployment information. Where would you pull that unemployment information from? And what's the most recent information that you can get? Draft a goal statement and several objectives for the project that you want to get funded, and talk those over with your team to make sure that they are realistic and achievable. And that concludes our grant writing basics webinar. I hope that this was helpful to you. Again, we will be putting this webinar on our website, as we will with FPP4, and then we will also be doing a quarterly reporting webinar for FPPG. We will just put that directly on our website, and we will send a message to all the FPPG recipients when that website or when that webinar goes live on our website. We thank you for being with us. Vivian, do we have any questions this morning?
No, David, we don't have any questions.
Well, very good. Then I hope that this was helpful, and we will hopefully see most of you at the conference in October. Have a great morning.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.